Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversations is a podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. This third series of Nepal Conversations will focus on unpacking the status of social science research and teaching in Nepal.
In today's Nepal Conversations, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Sara Shneiderman, who is an associate professor in the University of British Columbia's Department of Anthropology as well as in UBC's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Institute of Asian Research. Dr. Shneiderman is a social anthropologist with long-term ethnographic commitments in the Himalayas and South Asia and emerging research engagement in British Columbia, Canada. Her research explores how social transformation is shaped by dynamics of citizenship and belonging in relation to indigenous ethnic, religious, and gender identities, cross-border mobility, conflict and political mobilization, territory and land use, development discourses and practices, and disaster aftermath and preparedness.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us today. You've had long-standing research involvement in Nepal, looking at the various transitions, tensions, and transformations facing Nepali society. What motivates you to continue doing research in Nepal? It'll be really nice to hear about your experiences.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with both of you, Uma and Nimesh, and I am just really excited to see how this whole series is unfolding, and it's an honor to be part of it. I could speak about this question for a very long time, but I'll try to make it short. Basically, I first came to Nepal when I was 19 years old. This is now almost 30 years ago. And I came as a college student on a study abroad program. I was already studying anthropology for my BA at the time, and I had never been to Nepal before then, but I felt a deep connection with many of the people whom I met, and also the particular challenges that they were facing. I think some of that comes out of my own personal experiences, my own positionality as a second generation Jewish American. I grew up in Washington, DC. My parents had been from New York, and my grandparents had emigrated to the US during the Second World War as refugees from the Holocaust. And so I grew up with this deep sense, I think, of displacement and questioning about my own sense of identity and belonging. And I think what I found when I first came to Nepal is that many of the people whom I encountered and lived with were exploring those questions for themselves in very powerful ways, which resonated with me personally, even though, of course, the starting points and the context were very different from what I had experienced. And so I forged many strong relationships, even at the beginning, several of which are still very important relationships in my own life, professionally and personally today. And from then on, I felt very much engaged, again, professionally and personally, with the experiences of my close friends and interlocutors in Nepal. So I continued wanting to come back to explore, to go deeper. And as I developed my own research engagement, I shifted between different parts of the country. I first started out working in Mustang, and the very first research I ever did in Nepal was about women's religious experiences in Bonpo contexts in Mustang. Then later I shifted to working with the Thangmi community in Dolakha and Sindhupalchowk. I also worked with the Thangmi community in India, in Darjeeling and Sikkim. And then more recently, I've been working with people suffering from the consequences of the 2015 earthquakes and trying to understand their experiences of post-disaster reconstruction. Also along the way, the Maoist state conflict unfolded, and that became a big part of the life story of people with whom I was working. So I think, really in answer to your question, I have wanted to continue understanding what has happened and what the challenges and joys and opportunities are for the people with whom I work in Nepal, And it's never a kind of finished story. I'm not the kind of scholar who comes in quickly, collects a bunch of material, writes something, and then moves on to the next topic. Rather, my own research engagement is built on deep relationships with people and place. And because of that, there's not really a way to sort of end it, nor would I want to. Rather, it's about unfolding stories that continue and my own relationship with those stories and the people who are, of course, producing them for themselves. The other thing is that actually I am not only working in Nepal anymore. I've now settled here in British Columbia, Canada, and I've been here for about 7 years. It's the longest time I've lived anywhere outside of Nepal during my entire adult life. And so I've been engaging with research questions here in a new way, but they have a lot of continuity with the ongoing questions that I'm involved with in Nepal, particularly around both mobility and ethnicity, and now disaster and recovery. And so I've also found that rather than thinking about I work in Nepal or I work in BC, rather these two elements are complementary. And I think there's a great deal to be learned from Nepal's experiences and from individual lived experience that is actually relevant for the rest of the world. So this is kind of one of the agendas that I have now, is thinking about, well, how do we bring knowledge that's generated in Nepal and about specifically Nepali conversations into global conversation, both scholarly and also policy oriented. And so one of the ways I see that happening is through discussions around disaster. And so really my continued work in Nepal is also engaged with work elsewhere in the world. And I think they are mutually sort of co-producing in terms of the, and they're sort of taking knowledge to the next level in both contexts.
Thanks, Sarah. That's really fascinating. I just wanted to follow up on that, on your kind of more recent research on the socio-political dimensions of disasters. And because you mentioned that your original and more longitudinal ethnographic research on Nepal is focused more on cultural and ethnic dimensions of the Nepali society, and which is also documented in your 2015 book, Rituals of Ethnicity, Thangmi, Identities Between Nepal and India. So just if you could tell a little bit about, what prompted you to start looking at the social and political dimensions of the disaster, and how possibly how these two distinct streams of research are connected. Is there some kind of continuity to what you did before and what you're doing now? So if you could also talk a little bit about that idea of change in research direction and perhaps continuity, that would be great.
Thanks so much for that question. Yeah, this is something that I've reflected upon a lot recently, so it's good to have a chance to talk about it. As I mentioned, when I first came to Nepal, some of the dynamics that most struck me were around ethnic and indigenous movements. And I came to Nepal in the mid-1990s. And as you know, this was precisely when the Janjati Andolan was really beginning to gain force. And those questions around ethnic identity and belonging really seemed to be at the top of so many people's minds. They were also really in the air in terms of public discourse and also what you would experience on the street. And as I began working with the Thangmi community, I actually came into that research project, which started actually as a Fulbright research project before I started my doctoral work at Cornell. And then it continued into my doctoral work. When I first started working with the Thangmi community, I had actually a very open agenda. I came to that community because I had also met my partner and husband, Mark Turin, in Nepal. He was then doing linguistic anthropological research with the Thangmi, and I first visited Thangmi localities in Dolakha and Sindhupalchowk with him in the late 1990s. And I came to understand that actually there was very little representation of the Thangmi in ethnographic or political literature around ethnicity. And this was something that that community really wanted at the time. And so I first came to them with this kind of sense of, I want to engage with this community. There's a desire here. I was actually being asked to conduct research with them rather than coming as a researcher with a set agenda. And as we began to develop that research, the research agenda really, it became very clear that what was on people's minds was this question of ethnic identity and belonging and its political mobilization. And as you'll know from my book, there are many different aspects of that. And I worked with many people also who were not necessarily so interested in the political project, but were very interested in the kind of cultural preservation and heritage element. So I developed that research project in dialogue with the community, and my intention was always to, in a sense, work alongside their agendas by forwarding the issues that were most important to them. After the earthquakes of 2015, which incidentally happened really right when my book was coming to publication, which was in a sense, quite difficult for all kinds of reasons, it became clear that the kind of concerns around ethnic identity, political mobilization, and also cultural preservation were suddenly forced to take a back burner because of the outright material devastation that people experienced in the earthquakes. And this was just incredibly difficult to really observe and be part of, even from a distance. And I came to realize that actually the work that I had done, while very important, had very little engagement with materiality, the sort of nuts and bolts of people's lives, and that there was actually relatively little that I had come to understand that could be of immediate pragmatic use as people were starting to recover from the earthquakes. And I have to credit Anil Bhattarai in particular for a sort of long and extensive conversation about this on social media and elsewhere, where the question was really put to me: what good is the kind of cultural knowledge that anthropologists have focused on when people are facing, these kind of outright, really just devastating material consequences? And so that prompted me to think about this more deeply and to consider, okay, how could I then continue to be engaged with the families with whom I was already close and had spent really a lot of difficult conversations and time with, trying to garner support and funding in the immediate post-earthquake context? How could that turn into a sort of longer term inquiry into what they were experiencing? And that's also at that time what people seem to be seeking. So I think the real point here is that as an anthropologist, my research agendas are not sort of created in the academy and then brought to the field. It's rather that I'm in constant dialogue with the people with whom I work, and I'm attending to their shifting interests and needs. So it would have been really strange for me to continue with a research agenda focusing on themes which were, at least at that moment, not on the top of people's minds. So that's part of what prompted me to shift direction. And I think there's also, I had a previous experience of this as well in terms of coming to understand the Maoist insurgency, which again was not at all a research focus for me. But as I was working on my doctoral project around ethnic identity and mobility in the Thangmi community, that happened around us and became clearly a very important part of people's lives. So it would have been disingenuous to not attend to that because I had some preconceived theoretical notion of the scope of my own research. And that's what happened again with the disaster. The other thing I wanted to mention about the connections between my work over time is that My earlier work about ethnicity and mobility really has to do with how marginalized people make claims vis-a-vis the states in which they live. That's really the broader framework analytically that my book, Rituals of Ethnicity, is situated in. And I realized as I started to understand what was happening for people after the earthquake, that those same kinds of questions needed to be asked. So even though the content or the focus is about the materiality of people's houses and how they are able to rebuild, the bigger framework there is really a set of questions about state-society relations and how marginalized community members are able to mobilize and work with their own sense of agency to make claims upon the state. So although in my more recent work that has been about garnering resources to rebuild, there's very much a kind of thread that connects it to the earlier work about making claims vis-a-vis ethnic and indigenous identities. And that's what I see really as the connecting thread also with the work that I'm doing here in British Columbia now. When people ask me here, how can you really build upon your work in Nepal to say anything relevant to this context, it's really the same set of structural questions that I see, that we have marginalized communities here, indigenous, rural, and others who are making certain kinds of claims upon the state in terms of their well-being and resilience in the face of various kinds of disasters, climate-induced and otherwise. So that broader framework provides a real sense of continuity for me across these different themes and places.
Thank you so much, Sara, for sharing that research journey with us. We've just had an opportunity to read one of your recent articles titled The Ethnography of Collaboration, Navigating Power Relationships in Joint Research, which was published in Collaborative Anthropologies. I understand this research was conducted in collaboration with two institutional partners in Nepal, Social Science Baha and the Central Department of Anthropology at Tribhuvan University. And in the article, you engage with the questions of and tensions in pursuing collaborative research. You argue in the paper that collaboration does not necessarily equate to more equitable research. What do you mean by this? And could you tell us a bit about the general context of writing this paper?
Thanks a lot for bringing this up. It's really one of the kind of most important dimensions of the work that I've been engaged with recently. And thank you also for highlighting the co-authored nature of this paper. I want to acknowledge the lead authors, Omar Ajazi and Emily Ambergy, Bina, Limbu, Manoj, Suji, James Banks, Courtney Balazman, Catherine Rankin, and myself. I come only as last author. So before speaking more about it, I just want to situate that. This paper emerged from the long-term partnership development grant that we had from the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council that focused on post-disaster reconstruction in Nepal. And that began in 2017. And that grant, managing that grant, was my first experience doing this kind of really large-scale collaborative work with over 20 different research team members. I had previously worked collaboratively with community members in the earlier work that we were talking about a moment ago, and I had also done some co-authoring work with other colleagues over time, but I had never been in the position of responsibility for as the principal investigator for managing such a large collaboration. And I think I learned a great deal through that process about what is and is not possible within a team-based collaborative framework, especially when it engages many different people, researchers from different disciplinary backgrounds with different life experiences at different points in their own career trajectory, and with very different access to resources. And as we moved through that project, which worked with Social Science Baha in Nepal as a lead institutional partner, many of us began to realize in different ways that we were coming up against some real challenges in terms of the structural power relations that we were embedded in. And this became clear despite, I think, all of our best intentions and also a real commitment to working productively together, that there were certain elements of the way our collaboration was structured, quite literally, which were very difficult to overcome to actually create a genuinely equitable space for knowledge production. And we began talking about these issues on a shared research and field visit in 2018, where we visited one of the field sites in which we were working in Sindhupalchowk as a group. And after that visit, Omer Ajazi, who was then a doctoral candidate at UBC, who was working with the project, spoke with me about some of the discomfort he had felt. And it turned out that he had been having these conversations with other members of the team as well. And that really cracked open some of these kinds of often, I guess, open secrets, but unspoken challenges that I think many people experience in this kind of collaborative teamwork. And although it was initially difficult, I felt extremely grateful that that conversation had been opened up and that we were then, alongside the research articles that we were already working on writing, we were able to take the time in our subsequent workshops to really focus on this question of power relationships and have different members of the team from all of these different positionalities share their own experiences. And that led to this article. So, I mean, you asked about what do we mean when we say collaboration doesn't necessarily equate to more equitable research. What we mean is that, especially here in Canada, I think perhaps even more so than in the US or the UK, although I'm not entirely sure, here in Canada, there's a really strong push towards collaboration and community-based research, which in theory is very laudable, and I think part of larger moves towards decolonizing the academy. But what's often not talked about is that sort of black box of what collaboration actually entails and what the logistics and the structures in which it must be carried out are. So we felt like what we really wanted to do was to make transparent or make visible many of the things which were sort of taken for granted and hush-hushed and not really, that we were not able to speak about. And for each of us participating in that article, you know, these were different elements. For me, as the principal investigator, the main issue was that the administrative setup for actually transferring funds from Canada to Nepal was incredibly arduous. And it basically took an entire year of my life as a scholar and a researcher to simply make the bank transfer to enable the research to unfold in the way that it had been proposed and funded in Nepal. And yet the labor that it took for me to do that and all of the challenges I encountered in my own university was entirely invisible to other members of the project. And so from my perspective, this was an opportunity to clarify some of that, to talk about some of those structures, and also push back at our own university and funding systems, which assume certain kinds of labor, emotional labor from academics to enable certain kinds of projects to unfold. For many other colleagues in the paper, the specific challenges were different, but what we realized was that we were all facing these sorts of structural constraints that were, in a sense, keeping us from having the truly equitable process that we had all, I think, hoped for. And writing this paper and visibilizing some of those issues, I think, really helped all of us, not necessarily to dissolve those structures and suddenly come to a more equitable space, but to identify what some of those issues are. And I think all of us are continuing to work towards transforming them in our own ways.
Thanks, Sara. That's really, I really enjoyed reading that paper and what you say. It's really a concrete kind of contribution to address what you mentioned as a black box of collaborative research. So thanks for that. So we also had the opportunity to read your forthcoming paper in the journal Current Anthropology, which is entitled House, Household and Home, Revisiting Anthropological and Policy Frameworks Through Post-Earthquake Reconstruction Experiences in Nepal. And this is co-authored with Bina, Limbu, Jeevan, Baniya, Manoj, Suji, Nabin, Rawal, Prakash, Chandra, Subedi, Cameron, David, Warner. And I understand this research was conducted in collaboration with two institutional partners in Nepal, Science Baha and the Central Department of Anthropology at Tribhuvan University. And one thing that I thought was very interesting is the use and critique of various terms and terminologies. So the paper seems to challenge what you say is the universalizing definitions of house and household, and seeks to develop more context-specific interpretation of these terms in the context of post-earthquake reconstruction. At the same time, the paper also draws on Western theories, concepts, and frameworks. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do you bring these different elements together in a way that critically examines universally adopted ideas, concepts, and terminologies and their contextual application. So if you could talk a little bit about sort of bringing those different elements together as part of this collaborative research, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks. Again, it's great to have an opportunity to speak about this because you've really identified one of the kind of underlying agendas of that piece. And I want to say first, again, this is a co-authored piece that emerges from the same project that we were talking about a moment ago, funded by the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council in collaboration with Social Science Baha. And just for listeners to be clear, this article is forthcoming in the journal Current Anthropology, which means that it's been accepted for publication, but we actually don't yet know exactly when it will be available. So we'll keep you updated about that, but it's great to have an opportunity to speak about it now. So in this paper, really what we were trying to do, and again, this emerged from the field research experience, was to share many of the observations that all of us engaged with the paper made as ethnographic, through our ethnographic engagement over time in different areas of earthquake affected Nepal, where we were seeing how the reconstruction program, the National Reconstruction Authority's formal private housing reconstruction program, was having several unintended consequences. And I think, most people who are familiar with Nepal in the post-earthquake period will have a sense of what this means. And there are of course, many reports from organizations like the Asia Foundation and Amnesty International and the NRA itself and many other organizations that document elements of the scenario that we also describe, which is that many people who received the post-earthquake private housing reconstruction subsidies to rebuild their destroyed homes were constrained by the framework of that program and ended up building structures which do not necessarily fit their own sense of a desire for home in the kind of affective sense, because they had to meet certain kinds of material criteria for how the house as a physical structure was to be constructed in a resilient manner. So I just mentioned home and house, and the third term that we look at is the term household, which is a kinship-based term which defines the people who are actually presumed to live in the house. And what we were really trying to understand was how could there have been this outcome, despite all good intentions, and really what in many ways has been celebrated as a really positive application of the owner-driven reconstruction framework, which is kind of in opposition to, or sort of different from the state or other organizations coming in and building like large housing colonies. So the idea here was that householders or house owners themselves would have the resources to construct their own houses, and yet still you ended up with a situation where those structures were often not being used in the way they were intended or not meeting people's social and cultural needs. So that was based on our observations in the field. And then we turned to look at policy documents. And what we started to understand was that although in the social science literature, we have really in-depth discussions around these concepts of house, household, and home, often those concepts themselves were not well defined in the policy documents that were being used to set up the program. And so we sort of identified that as a disjuncture, which is ironic precisely because there has been a long-standing really influence from social science literature on these themes through the international development industry into Nepali state categorizations of house, household, and home. And those elements predate the earthquake. You see discussion around these issues in earlier census monographs and other kinds of policy spaces. So the point that we're really trying to make here is that actually, yes, as you put it, Western theoretical frameworks for understanding what the house and household are have actually sort of through these often really unstudied back doors through development and policy kind of knowledge building, report writing, and so forth. Through these back doors, these concepts have actually entered Nepali government framings of what house and household not only are, but should be in a kind of prescriptive manner. And that is part of what has led to the somewhat unsatisfying outcomes of the Reconstruction program. So, I think part of the question you have is, well, why are you drawing upon Western theories and frameworks when actually this is a paper about Nepali experiences? And I just want to highlight that we are also very much starting our analysis from Nepali concepts and categories, particularly around the ideas of the difference between Gar, Chulo, and Garduri. And these were concepts that our interlocutors brought up again and again to talk about this kind of disjuncture in their experience. So we build out from that, but then we sort of want to identify how those categories don't really fit the categories, the universalizing categories of the policy literature, and that even when the policy documents are produced by the Nepali state, they actually have drawn upon this longstanding edifice of social scientific research that has promoted certain kinds of ideas, and that's what we're trying to reveal.
Thank you so much, Sara. We are almost at the end of our conversations for today, but before we go, one final question. Given your long-standing research and research collaboration in Nepal, what do you think is the future of social science research and teaching in Nepal? What are the opportunities and what needs to change?
I think it's the future is really bright. I have been incredibly impressed by all of the developments in the social science research landscape in Nepal over the last 25 years since I have been part of it, in terms of both institutional development of many different research organizations, but also I think the emergence of scholars from Nepal who are trained in both Nepal and outside Nepal and are really bringing all kinds of new perspectives to the research domain. And that, of course, includes both of you also. And I think just the fact that we're here having this conversation is a really wonderful indication of the kind of sophistication of the kind of discourse, as well as the kind of research prospects that we have. At the same time, I think that I've seen the field becoming more and more crowded, and this is not only in Nepal, this is everywhere. So I think there are many challenges for emerging scholars in terms of job opportunities, both inside and outside Nepal. And this is something that I think we should be speaking about honestly. This comes also from my perspective as a faculty member at a Canadian university, wanting to be able to support graduate students here, but also feeling very conflicted about that because of what I know about the challenges at the other end. So I think it would be good to have some open conversations about what that looks like. I think also that, there have been many really productive conversations around the relationships in Nepal between public universities and private research institutions. And I think continuing to have that conversation and structurally working out how these differently situated institutions can mutually support each other is really important. And I see that happening in a lot of ways already, and I hope that continues. For me, like, one of the things that's been most interesting about working collaboratively on the papers that we've been speaking about earlier in the session has been understanding some of the different approaches, let's say, to research and writing that scholars come to this context with. And I think that one of the things that's also motivated my work over time has been storytelling and the ability to tell stories about real people's lives from an ethnographic perspective. And one of the things I've come to feel is that there is a tension in the Nepali research context between a vision of ethnographic research, which is focused on that kind of storytelling dimension, and the kind of commitment to empirical research, which really wants to find a way to validate and make objective ethnographic observation. And again, that's a broader tension within anthropology and related fields, but I see it playing out in very specific ways in the Nepali context. So I feel like there's an opportunity for some open conversations about this, and what does it mean to work as an individual or in a team as an ethnographer? What does it mean to write about those experiences? How is it different individually or collaboratively? And what kinds of voice and claims to authority are people making, and what is actually, and how can we understand a kind of continuum of approaches as all acceptable within the framework of social science research in Nepal, rather than thinking that it must be one or the other, more quantitative or more qualitative, for instance, more storytelling or more empirical, so to speak. And of course, storytelling work is also deeply empirical, but I think there's a sense in which there can be a critique of certain kinds of narrative voice. So that's something that's interested me lately, and I would like to continue to have those conversations.
That's wonderful, Sara. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.